The rain battered Seattle's skyline, streaking down the glass walls of Pinnacle Tower like tears from a wounded sky. The city's lights flickered through the deluge, casting a muted glow over the streets below, where umbrellas bobbed like black flowers in the storm. Inside the 50th floor boardroom, the air was thick with tension, the kind that hums before a storm breaks. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, their sterile light glinting off a polished mahogany table that stretched the length of the room. Billionaire CEO Victor Grayson paced at the head of it, his tailored charcoal suit creased from hours of frustration, his silver hair catching the light like a crown. His voice, sharp as a blade, sliced through the silence, reverberating off the glass walls. "Where the hell is the translator?" he barked, his piercing blue eyes darting to his team of executives, who sat frozen in their leather chairs, their faces pale as porcelain. "We're about to lose a $2 billion deal, because none of you can speak Mandarin." His words were a whip, lashing out at the 6 men and women who formed his inner circle, each one a pillar of privilege and ambition, now reduced to nervous glances and fidgeting hands. At the far end of the room, unnoticed by all, a janitor named Marcus Ellis mopped the marble floor. His navy uniform blended into the shadows, the Pinnacle Technologies logo stitched in white over his chest. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were invisible, just another fixture in the gleaming corporate machine. But Marcus wasn't just listening. He was absorbing every word, every nuance, his dark eyes flicking toward the chaos with quiet curiosity. The executives ignored him, their whispers dripping with disdain as they scrambled for solutions, their laptops open, phones buzzing with desperate calls to translation agencies. Grayson's impatience boiled over, his face reddening as he slammed a fist on the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "I don't pay you people to fail me," he roared, his voice trembling with the weight of a deal slipping through his fingers. "The Chinese delegation arrives in 10 minutes, and we're dead in the water without a translator." His eyes swept the room, landing on Claire Voss, the CFO, whose icy stare usually silenced underlings but now faltered under his gaze. "Claire, you said you had this handled." Claire's lips tightened, her manicured nails tapping the table. "I called every agency in the city, Victor," she said, her voice clipped but unsteady. "They're booked. We're out of options." Marcus paused, his mop stilling against the floor. A faint smile tugged at his lips, unnoticed by the room. He adjusted his cap, the gesture small but deliberate, his eyes gleaming with something unreadable. Confidence, perhaps, or the quiet certainty of someone who knew more than they let on. The executives continued their frantic whispers, oblivious to the shift in the air. Grayson's pacing grew erratic, his hands raking through his hair as he muttered about the stakes. A $2 billion contract with Zhang Enterprises, a Chinese steel giant, that could redefine Pinnacle's dominance in AI-driven manufacturing. Without a translator, the deal was as good as dead. Marcus set his mop against the wall, the soft clink of the handle barely audible over Grayson's tirade. He stepped forward, his boots silent on the marble, and cleared his throat. The sound was soft, almost deferential, but it cut through the tension like a knife. Grayson spun toward him, his face a mix of irritation and disbelief, his eyes narrowing at the audacity of the interruption. "What do you want?" he snapped, his voice dripping with contempt. "This isn't the time for interruptions, janitor." Marcus met his gaze, unflinching, his posture calm but unyielding. "I can help," he said, his voice low but steady, each word carrying a quiet strength that seemed to anchor the room. The executives froze, their heads turning in unison, their expressions a mix of confusion and amusement. "You," Claire said, her lips curling into a smirk, her tone laced with condescension. "You're the janitor. What could you possibly do?" Marcus didn't blink. "I speak Mandarin," he said simply, fluently. Grayson laughed, a harsh, barking sound that echoed off the walls. "You're telling me the guy mopping my floors is going to save a $2 billion deal? Get real." His words were meant to dismiss, to reassert his control, but there was a flicker of desperation in his eyes, a crack in his armor as the clock ticked closer to the delegation's arrival. The boardroom door swung open and the Chinese delegation entered. 5 men in sharp suits, their movements precise, their presence commanding. Leading them was Mr. Zhang Wei, a steel magnate whose calm demeanor belied his reputation as a ruthless negotiator. His dark eyes scanned the room, taking in the polished table, the chandeliers, the nervous executives. Grayson plastered on a smile, but his eyes betrayed panic as he greeted them in English. His words met with polite but blank nods. Zhang's interpreter, a young woman named Li Mei, stepped forward. Her voice clipped as she spoke briefly in Mandarin. "They're ready to begin," she said, her tone professional but strained, her eyes flicking nervously to Zhang. But Mr. Zhang prefers to negotiate in Mandarin for clarity. Grayson's smile faltered, his hands clenching at his sides. "Of course," he said, his voice tight, barely masking his frustration. He turned to his team, his whisper venomous. "Find someone. Now!" Claire stood, her heels clicking sharply as she approached the delegation with a forced smile. "We're working on securing a translator," she said, her words stalling as Zhang's eyes narrowed, his patience visibly thinning. The room felt like it was shrinking, the air heavy with the weight of a deal teetering on the edge of collapse. David Lin, the VP of Operations, fidgeted with his tie, his face flushed as he scrolled through his phone, muttering about agencies that hadn't returned his calls. Marcus, still in the corner, cleared his throat again, louder this time. Grayson's head snapped toward him, his irritation boiling over. "I told you to stay out of this," he barked, but Zhang, watching from across the room, tilted his head, his eyes locking onto Marcus with interest. "Let him speak," Zhang said through Li Mei, his tone calm but commanding, carrying the weight of a man who was used to being obeyed. The delegation stood silently, their gazes shifting to Marcus, who stood alone in his Navy uniform, a stark contrast to the sea of tailored suits. Grayson hesitated, his jaw tightening, his mind racing. The clock was ticking, and he was out of options. "Fine," he said, waving a hand dismissively, his voice laced with skepticism. "But if you embarrass me, you're out of a job." Marcus stepped forward, his movements unhurried, almost ceremonial. He bowed slightly to Zhang, a gesture of respect that drew a nod from the magnate. Then, in flawless Mandarin, Marcus spoke, his words smooth and confident, flowed with the ease of a native speaker. He introduced himself as a representative of Pinnacle, offering apologies for the delay and assuring the delegation that their concerns would be addressed with precision. The delegation's faces lit up and Zhang nodded, a faint smile breaking his stoic expression. The executives froze, their smugness replaced by shock. Claire's smirk vanished, her eyes wide as she leaned toward David, whispering, "Where did he learn to speak like that?" David shook his head, his gaze fixed on Marcus, who was now the center of the room's attention. Grayson's eyes widened, but he said nothing, his mind racing to process what was happening. Marcus wasn't just speaking, he was commanding the room, his voice steady, his presence undeniable. As the negotiations began, Zhang outlined his terms, specifications for a new AI-driven manufacturing system, timelines, and pricing. Marcus didn't just translate. He clarified technical details, catching subtle errors in Li Mei's interpretations and correcting them with precision. When Zhang mentioned a concern about data security, Marcus seamlessly interjected, explaining Pinnacle's encryption protocols in technical Mandarin, citing standards like AES 256 and ISO 27001. Zhang's eyebrows rose and he leaned forward, engaged, his earlier skepticism replaced by respect. Grayson, still reeling, tried to regain control. "Marcus, tell them we can deliver in 6 months," he said, his tone sharp, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Marcus translated, but added a subtle caveat in Mandarin. "Pinnacle is confident in a 6-month timeline, provided we align on resource allocation." Zhang nodded, his trust in Marcus growing, his eyes flicking to Grayson with a hint of amusement. The executives exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence shaken. Claire leaned toward Grayson, her voice low. "How does a janitor know encryption standards?" Grayson didn't answer, his eyes narrowing as he watched Marcus. The janitor wasn't just fluent, he was too polished, too knowledgeable. Something wasn't adding up, and Grayson's unease grew with every word Marcus spoke. The negotiations hit a critical point when Zhang presented a contract amendment, a dense document filled with Mandarin legalese. Li Mei struggled to translate, her words faltering as she stumbled over technical terms, her hands trembling slightly as she flipped through the pages. The room grew tense, the deal teetering on the edge of collapse. Grayson's face was a mask of panic, his fingers drumming on the table as he turned to Marcus, his voice low and urgent. "Fix this. Now." Marcus took the document, his eyes scanning the text with the speed of someone who'd read contracts before. He spoke in Mandarin, his voice calm but authoritative, outlining the amendment's implications. Potential liability clauses that could cost Pinnacle millions if ignored. Zhang listened intently, then asked a pointed question about intellectual property rights, his tone testing, his eyes sharp. Marcus didn't hesitate. "Mr. Zhang, Pinnacle's IP framework complies with international standards," he said in Mandarin, then switched to English for Grayson's benefit. "But the amendment's Clause 7.2 could expose Pinnacle to litigation in Chinese courts. I'd recommend a counterproposal to limit jurisdiction to international arbitration." His words were precise, his delivery calm, as if he'd navigated these waters 1,000 times. The room went silent. Grayson's jaw dropped, his face a mix of shock and fury. Claire's pen slipped from her hand, clattering on the table, the sound deafening in the stillness. David's mouth hung open, his earlier fidgeting forgotten. The other executives stared, their faces a gallery of disbelief. "How the hell do you know that?" Grayson demanded, his voice rising, his control slipping away. Marcus turned to him, his expression calm but unyielding, his dark eyes locking onto Grayson's. "Because I'm not just a janitor," he said, his voice steady, each word a quiet rebuke. "I'm Marcus Ellis, former lead counsel for Sinotech's North American division. I've negotiated contracts like this for years." The executives gasped, their whispers erupting into a low hum of shock. Claire's hand flew to her mouth, her icy composure shattered. David leaned back, a mix of awe and embarrassment on his face. Grayson's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, his world unraveling in front of him. Zhang, sensing the shift, spoke through Li Mei, his voice calm but curious. "Mr. Ellis, why are you working as a janitor?" Marcus's eyes softened, but his voice held steel. "I stepped away from corporate law after a case exposed corruption in my firm," he said, his tone measured but firm. "I saw executives like you, Mr. Grayson, prioritize profit over people, bending rules to protect their own. I wanted to start over, somewhere I could be invisible for a while. But I never stopped learning." Zhang nodded, respect gleaming in his eyes. "You've saved this deal," he said to Li Mei, his voice carrying a rare warmth. "I trust you." Grayson's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white, his pride battered. The janitor he'd dismissed, the man he'd mocked, was now the most powerful person in the room, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. Marcus took control, guiding the negotiations with precision that left the delegation in awe. He rewrote the amendment on the spot, balancing Pinnacle's interests with Zhang's demands, his pen moving swiftly across the page as he dictated terms in Mandarin and English. Every word he spoke carried weight, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Grayson's flustered attempt to interject. When Grayson tried to interrupt, his voice sharp with frustration, Marcus held up a hand, his tone firm but respectful. "Mr. Grayson, with respect, let me finish. This clause could cost you everything." His words were a quiet command, and the room froze. No one had ever spoken to Grayson like that, not in his own boardroom, not in his own empire. Claire's eyes widened, her earlier smirk a distant memory. David hid a smirk of his own, his respect for Marcus growing. Zhang, watching the exchange, leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips as he observed the power shift. Marcus turned to the delegation, speaking in Mandarin, his voice steady and diplomatic. "Pinnacle values this partnership and proposes a joint oversight committee to address IP concerns. This ensures trust and accountability for both parties." Zhang nodded, his pen moving swiftly as he signed the amended contract. The deal was sealed, A $2 billion partnership saved by the man Grayson had mocked. The delegation rose, their handshakes warm as they thanked Marcus personally, their voices filled with gratitude. Zhang handed him a business card, his eyes gleaming with respect. "If you ever return to law, call me," he said through Limei, his tone sincere. Grayson stood, his pride battered but his pragmatism kicking in. He cleared his throat, his voice strained as he addressed Marcus. "Marcus," he said, the word heavy in his mouth. "We need to talk. I want you on my legal team. Name your price." Marcus looked at him, his expression unreadable, his eyes searching Grayson's face for something, sincerity perhaps, or accountability. "I'll consider it," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "But only if Pinnacle starts valuing people over profits. I've seen what happens when companies forget that, and I won't be part of it again." Claire and the executives exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier arrogance deflated. Grayson nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes flickering with a mix of resentment and respect. "We'll discuss terms tomorrow," he said, his voice quieter now, the fight drained out of him. As Marcus walked out, his boots silent on the marble floor, the boardroom felt smaller, the executives' confidence shattered. They'd underestimated him, dismissed him, and it had cost them their pride. But Marcus didn't need their validation. He'd already won. Not just a deal, but something deeper, something that lingered in the air as he stepped into the elevator. The rain had stopped, and Seattle's skyline glowed under a clearing sky, the clouds parting to reveal a city reborn in light. Marcus stood outside Pinnacle Tower, his janitor's uniform still on, but his posture straighter, his eyes brighter, as if he'd shed an invisible weight. He'd walked into that room as an invisible man, a shadow in a world of power and privilege, and left as a force no one could ignore. This wasn't just about one deal, one moment in a boardroom high above the city. It was about every time someone's worth is judged by their title, their clothes, their skin. Marcus had spent years being overlooked, his talents buried under assumptions and biases. But he'd never stopped learning, never stopped proving that knowledge and character outweigh power and privilege. He'd seen the corporate world's underbelly, its greed and corruption, and he'd chosen to step away, to rebuild himself in the quiet spaces where no one looked. But today, he'd stepped into the light, and the world had shifted. In a society quick to judge, Marcus Ellis was a reminder. The quiet ones, the underestimated ones, often hold the keys to change. His story wasn't just about a $2 billion deal or a billionaire's humiliation. It was about the power of resilience, the strength of those who refuse to be defined by others' expectations. As he walked down the street, the city's lights reflecting in his eyes, Marcus carried a truth that echoed beyond the glass towers. Real power doesn't come from a title or suit. It comes from within. If this story made you feel something, anger at the injustice, hope for the underdog, or inspiration to challenge assumptions, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories that remind us. Never judge a book by its cover, because the ones you overlook might just change the world.